Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for March 24th, 2022. Today we have the spectacle of Mr. Biden goes to NATO. Biden is beginning a European tour. He's starting with NATO and the heads of state meeting of the NATO leaders. The question is he there to prepare NATO for a nuclear war? The statements that have been issued in the last couple of days from the Biden administration and from his junior varsity team of the National Security Advisor, Sullivan, Secretary of State Blinken, have been extremely bellicose and oriented toward the idea that we should be prepared for the possibility of nuclear war, minimally Russian chemical and biological weapon attacks, while denying that the Russians discovered a U.S. bioweapons lab in Ukraine, but at the same time raising the stakes by talking about nuclear war. The question that comes up when you hear this talk is, has Biden forgotten the pledge that he made during his meeting with Putin on June 16, 2021, when they had a summit and he and Putin reiterated what Reagan and Gorbachev had said and what the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council subsequently said, which is, quote, nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, unquote. Well, given that that's the official policy of the United States, one wonders what Jake Sullivan was intending when he was asked yesterday in a briefing about Biden's trip to Europe about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons. And Sullivan said, quote, we will be consulting with allies and partners on that potential contingency and discussing what our potential responses are, unquote. Potential contingency, in other words, that they're having planning for a likely or possible Russian nuclear strike, or is it the use of nuclear weapons from the West? Before he made that statement, he said, we have not changed our nuclear posture to date. Note he said to date. Then he said, but we are constantly monitoring for that potential contingency. Well, perhaps he could have said, we're attempting to provoke it. If you look at the policy coming from the United States and our so-called NATO allies, it appears that instead of attempting to encourage a de-escalation, they're doing the opposite. That the policies of the U.S. and NATO, as dictated by the corporate cartels, seems to be to encourage a longer, more destructive war. That is, that the policy that emerges is not one of de-escalation and resolution, but how do we keep this thing going? And what are they doing? More arms to Ukraine. The idea of possibly having the Polish serve as a depot, a weapons depot and delivery service, and possibly bringing NATO troops into Ukraine. Secondly, more U.S. and NATO troops into the Eastern European countries that were formerly part of either the Soviet Union or the Warsaw Pact, such as Poland and Estonia. More economic warfare to aim at the destruction of the Russian economy, even though the boomerang effect is being felt now with the blowback into the Western economies. And finally, further provocations. Blinken yesterday said that the U.S. military has concluded that the Russians are committing war crimes and that they will be held accountable for that in courts of law. He said, and Biden himself said, that Putin is committing war crimes with attacks on civilians and that this will be subject to prosecution after this war ends. Now, there are many military commentators, including General Douglas McGregor, or former Colonel Douglas McGregor, who have said that, in fact, there were more civilian deaths in the first hour of the U.S. NATO attack on Iraq with the shock and awe than there have been in 4 weeks of attacks in Ukraine. And this was also reaffirmed by correspondent William Arkin, who filed a report in Newsweek, who quoted military officials and veterans who said they've been surprised by Russia's constraint, their military constraint, and that they are not targeting civilian population. But if you only have access to the Western media, you get story after story of Russian brutality against the civilian population. Now, there's a very interesting interview that was conducted by Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone with veteran diplomat Chaz Freeman. Freeman, who served as a Deputy Secretary of Defense, who also was with President Nixon as a translator when China was opened. What Freeman told Aaron Mate really confirms our analysis of what's going on. Among the points he made is that this is a proxy war. It's not about Ukraine. Ukraine is being used by Western forces that are out to destroy Russia, and the Ukrainians are a victim of the Western intent to keep fighting, as Freeman said, to the last Ukrainian. He said, secondly, the neocons are delighted because their ultimate goal has always been regime change in Russia, and that this has not changed. And then he added the obvious point that the military-industrial complex is pleased as weapons and logistical expenditures are going up as the war continues. Now, what was not said by Freeman and has not been said by anyone I know of outside of us is that the ultimate goal is not just to degrade Russia and China, but for an intent which is to prevent Russia and China from organizing a potentially new financial and economic system. The containment of Russia and China has been the policy for quite a while. We see it with the talk of an Asian NATO, the Quad alliance, the U.S., Australia, UK alliance with nuclear submarines, the contention over the South China Sea and the Strait of Taiwan. Clearly, this is aimed at stopping China. The fake attack or fake stories of Xinjiang province, concentration camps, and so on, all of it is designed to destroy the potential of China to continue to grow through its Belt and Road Initiative. But the targeting of Russia is directly related to that because Russia and China are engaged in a process of integration on the Eurasian continent, which has implications far beyond Russia and China, implications for all of Southeast Asia, for Central Asia, for Southwest Asia, that is the Middle East, as well as into the Balkans, into the Mediterranean areas of Europe, and into Europe as a whole. Because the idea of the physical economic expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative with Russian cooperation means good business prospects for Western Europe as well. And so by painting Russia as a boogeyman that has to be contained, the attempt is to break this potential at precisely the point that the Western economies are blowing out, with hyperinflation, with shortages of energy, with shortages of fertilizer, food shortages coming. And none of this is caused by the war. It's caused by the completely insane economic policies of the last 50 years. Now, the target then is Eurasian integration, the Belt and Road Initiative, and the collapse of this Western system is causing them to move more aggressively. Now, will it cause Mr. Biden to discuss the use of nuclear weapons or limited nuclear weapons to stop Russia? Is the U.S. intelligence community telling Biden that the Russians are preparing to use nuclear weapons? Is the intelligence community seriously putting forward the idea that Russia is about to use chemical and biological weapons? Well, this was put forward about the Syrian government, and groups centered in London insisted that the Russians were aiding the Syrians in chemical warfare against their own population. It turns out that this has been exposed as a complete lie, a cover-up, and a fraud, and that the actual use of chemical weapons in Syria was done by the jihadists, not surprisingly. The surprising thing is the defense of the jihadists in Syria, the terrorists who are trying to bring down the Assad government. It's not surprising because the same thing today is that the U.S. is intervening on behalf of the Azov battalion and neo-Nazi groups inside the Ukrainian military. The obvious solution in Ukraine was stated by President Zelensky in a moment of clarity when he said Ukraine will not go into NATO, and he will negotiate some kind of settlement in eastern Ukraine. Well, if that's what he wants, why is the West pushing him not to negotiate? And Zelensky said he was told by NATO to say that Ukraine wants to get into NATO, even though he was told by those same people that NATO will not accept Ukraine. This is a war triggered by Western unwillingness to discuss security guarantees with Russia. It has to be brought to an end, and it has to be on the basis not just of no war, but on the basis of a move to a new security and financial architecture. Join the Schiller Institute in bringing about a conference on April 9th to discuss this alternative of economic development and cooperation as opposed to war and destruction. Thanks, and I'll see you again tomorrow.